On the night of December 16th, 1773, the Boston Tea Party took place, a pivotal act of rebellion that helped spark the growing American Revolution. The Tea Act, passed by the British Parliament and enforced by the struggling British East India Company, gave the company a monopoly on selling tea in the American colonies and upheld the principle of taxation without representation. In reaction, a band of emboldened Boston colonists called the Sons of Liberty staged a daring demonstration. Disguising themselves as Mohawk Indians, they bravely boarded the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and the Beaver, 3 British ships docked in Boston Harbor, and once they got in, they emptied 342 chests of tea into the frigid waters. The American Revolutionary War broke out when this dramatic and symbolic act of rebellion escalated tensions between the colonies and the British government, signaling the colonists' refusal to comply with unfair taxes and uniting public opinion against British rule. Inspiring countless generations to resist tyranny and battle for their rights, the Boston Tea Party is a manifestation of resistance and the dogged pursuit of liberty. Hello everyone, welcome to the party. Of course, we're doing a little bit more American history today, and I must admit, my entire life, I've never really looked into it, but now that I am having a great time. This is really interesting stuff for me, okay? So, with that being said, the best way to support the channel is like, subscribe, comment, you know all the things to do. And invite your friends to the party too. Share it around. Everybody's invited. And there's enough tea for everyone to drink. So with that being said, let's get nice and comfortable. I have some tea right here, albeit it's not the kind of English tea, some Chinese tea, some chrysanthemum. But you don't need to know about that. You came here for the Boston Tea Party, so let's do it. Now, first of all, it was never actually called the Boston Tea Party until later on. Originally, it was called the Destruction of the Tea, which is not as catchy of a name, but I guess it's pretty straightforward. The term Boston Tea Party became more prominent in the early 19th century. And so while briefly acknowledging the original naming convention, we will also refer to it by its more modern and well-known convention. And so we find the roots of the issue mainly in 2 factors. The financial troubles of the British East India Company, trying to chase their losses at the expense of others. Who would have thought that a corporation could ever do that? And of course a long-running debate over the extent to which Parliament could exercise authority over the British colonies without elected representatives. All of this gave rise to the Boston Tea Party. Now, in an effort to resolve these matters, the North Ministry clashed with the South, which sparked the Revolution, which in turn sparked the War of Independence, which ended British colonialism and led to a formation of the United States of America. After the Pine Tree Riot in Weir, New Hampshire in April 1772, when colonists protested heavy fines for tree harvesting, the Boston Tea Party was the second American tax rebellion against British royal authority. Of course, it wasn't the first, certainly the most well-known. But yes, there was also the Pine Tree Riot beforehand. And so in the 17th century, we go back a little bit to trace the roots of all this, as Europeans cultivated a preference for drinking tea. Competing companies emerged to import the commodity from China. Of course, not the China that we know today. Back then, it was under the rule of the Qing dynasty, and they were getting very, very rich off tea. In 1698, the British Parliament conferred a monopoly on tea importation to the East India Company. As tea gained popularity in the British colonies, Parliament enacted a law in 1721 mandating that colonists import their tea exclusively from Great Britain in an attempt to eradicate foreign competition. Of course, this certainly flies in the face of free trade principles. But what are principles when money is to be made? The East India Company was legally obligated to sell its tea at wholesale prices at auctions in England, rather than exporting it to the colonies. British companies, of course, procured this tea and exported it to the colonies, where it was resold to merchants in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. They'd effectively set up a system where all they had to do was copy and paste and copy and paste and keep doing the same thing, completely brainless money-making. As long as the tea kept coming from China, they could easily buy it at the lower price, sell it to the colonists at the higher price, and the colonists were not even allowed to look for a different deal. You can see how this is extremely unfair. But this was until 1767. The East India Company remitted a tax of approximately 25% on tea imported into Great Britain. Parliament imposed supplementary taxes on tea intended for consumption in Britain. The elevated taxes, coupled with the absence of taxation on imported tea by the Dutch government, allowed Britons and British Americans to procure smuggled Dutch tea, and it was a lot cheaper. It was the same tea as well. The only difference was the price. But of course, England, they constituted the largest market for illicit tea. By the 1760s, the East India Company was incurring annual losses of £400,000 due to the smugglers in Great Britain, while Dutch tea was also being smuggled into British America in considerable amounts, and that affects profits. In 1767, to assist the East India Company in competing with illicit Dutch tea, Parliament enacted the Indemnity Act, which reduced the tax on tea consumed in Great Britain and provided the East India Company with a refund of 25% duty on the tea re-exported to the colonies. To mitigate the decline in government revenue, Parliament enacted the Townshend Act of 1767, which imposed more new taxes, including the one on tea. Of course, this was only in the colonies. In the 1760s, a dispute emerged between Great Britain and the colonies when Parliament attempted, for the first time, to levy a direct tax on the colonies to generate revenue. Certain colonists, referred to as the American Patriots, opposed the new taxation scheme, contending that it constituted a breach in the British Constitution. Britons and British Americans concurred that, per the Constitution, British subjects could not be subjected to taxation without the approval of their elected representatives. In Great Britain, this signified that taxes could solely be imposed by the Parliament. Colonists, however, they did not elect representatives to the Parliament, leading American Whigs to contend that the colonies could not be subjected to taxation by that institution. They have a point, you know. The Whigs asserted that the colonists could only be subjected to taxation by their respective colonial assemblies. Colonial protests led to the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766. However, the Declaratory Act of the same year affirmed Parliament's claim to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Following the imposition of the new taxes under the Townshend Revenue Act of 1767, American patriots once more reacted with protests and boycotts. Merchants established non-importation agreements, and numerous colonists committed to refraining completely from consuming any British tea, while activists in New England advocated for alternatives like domestic brands of tea. Of course, the smugglers were doing a great business, and the smuggling persisted vigorously, particularly in New York and Philadelphia, where tea smuggling had historically been more prevalent than in Boston. Dutied British tea persisted in being imported into Boston, particularly by Richard Clark and the offspring of Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson, until pressure from Massachusetts Whigs forced compliance with the non-importation agreement. In 1770, Parliament ultimately addressed the protests by abolishing the Townshend taxes, with the exception of the tea duty, which Prime Minister Lord North retained to affirm the right of taxing the Americans. The partial repeal of the taxes sufficed to terminate the non-importation movement by October 1770, and between 1771 and 73, substantial quantities of British tea were imported into the colonies, with merchants remitting the Townshend duty of 3 pence per pound of tea. Boston was the preeminent colonial importer of legal tea, while the smugglers, of course, were mainly operating in New York and Philadelphia. The Indemnity Act of 1767, which provided the East India Company with a reimbursement on the duty of tea re-exported to the colonies, lapsed 5 years later in 1772, and in the same year Parliament enacted a new law that diminished the rebate, resulting in a 10% duty on tea imported into Britain, not what the East India Company wanted. More tough times ahead for them. The legislation reinstated the tea taxes in Britain that had been annulled in 1767 and maintained the 3 pence Townshend duty in the colonies. The new tax burden had increased the price of British tea, resulting in a significant decline in sales. The company persisted importing it into Great Britain, consequently accumulating a substantial surplus of unsold profit. And by the laws of supply and demand, well, the price just went down even further. Consequently, by late 1772, the East India Company, that pivotal commercial entity in Britain, faced a significant financial crisis. It didn't help that the catastrophic famine in Bengal from 1769 to 73 significantly diminished the East India Company's revenue from India, pushing the company to the brink of insolvency, prompting the enactment of the Tea Act of 1773 to assist the East India Company. One of the examples of parliamentary bailouts of big corporations. That's right, it goes back a long way. Of course, when we talk about global corporations, the East India Company's pretty much the first one. At least the first one I can think of. Well, all in all, eliminating certain taxes was a clear solution to the crisis. The East India Company initially aimed to have the Townshend duty rescinded, but the North Ministry was reluctant, very reluctant, as such a measure could be perceived as a concession to Parliament's authority to tax the colonies, and you give them an inch, they'd take a mile, of course. Significantly, the revenue generated from the Townshend duty was allocated to compensate certain colonial governors and judges. The Townshend tax aimed to ensure that officials previously compensated by colonial assemblies received their salaries from Parliament, no questions asked, thereby fostering their dependence on British government and diminishing their accountability to the colonists. I mean, think about it. They're going to go with the people who pay the bills, aren't they? There was a potential solution for alleviating the accumulating tea supplies in the East India Company warehouses, and that was to sell it to Europe, albeit at a reduced price. The option was examined, but it was concluded that the tea would merely just be smuggled back into Great Britain, which would undercut the taxed product. Put that idea to bed then. The most advantageous market for the East India Company's excess tea simply was the American colonies, provided a method could be devised to render it less expensive than that illicitly imported Dutch tea. And so they came up with an idea. The North Ministry's resolution was the Tea Act, which obtained King George's approval on May the 10th, 1773. This legislation reinstated the East India Company's complete reimbursement of the duty on tea imports into Britain, and for the first time authorized the company to independently export tea to the colonies. This would enable the company to decrease expenses by removing intermediaries who purchased the tea at wholesale auctions in London. The company had appointed colonial merchants to receive the tea on consignment rather than selling it to middlemen. The consignees will subsequently sell the tea for a commission. I'm sure a lot of people lost their jobs with that law. Imagine how well you would have been doing being a middleman in the tea trade. And then all of a sudden, because the big corporation can't do its accounting well enough, you lose your livelihood. Well, not so good back then. Have to learn to get another job. In July 1773, tea consignees were appointed in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Charleston. The Tea Act of 1773 permitted the transportation of 5,000 chests of tea, we're talking about 250 tons of it, to the American colonies. A tax of £1,750, which is about in US dollars, today's money about $300,000, was to be paid by the importers upon the cargo's arrival. The legislation conferred upon the East India Company was a monopoly on the sale of tea, priced lower than the smuggled alternatives, and its covert objective was to compel the colonists to remit a tax of 3 pence on each pound of tea. Consequently, the Act maintained the 3 pence Townshend duty on tea imports imported into the colony. Certain members of Parliament sought to abolish the tax, but they didn't get too far, contending that there was no justification for inciting another colonial dispute. Of course, many of the people in London knew at the time the situation that was brewing, and, well, they did not want to give the Americans any more excuses to cause a revolt. But then the people in power just decided to ignore that completely and just keep on poking the bear. Now, William Dowdeswell, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is kind of like the Ministry of Finance, cautioned Lord North that the Americans would reject the tea if the Townshend duty persisted. But North was reluctant to relinquish the revenue generated from the Townshend tax, particularly because it financed the salaries of colonial officials. Preserving the authority to tax the Americans was a secondary issue. Despite the implementation of the Townshend duty, the Tea Act would enable the East India Company to sell tea at a lower price than previously sold, undermining both prices set by the smugglers and those of colonial tea importers, who bore the tax without any real reimbursement. In 1772, legally imported Bohea, a prominent tea variety, was priced at approximately 3 shillings per pound. Subsequent to the Tea Act, colonial consignees were permitted to sell tea at 2 shillings a pound, which was slightly below the smuggler's rate of 2 shillings and 1 penny. The company, recognizing the political sensitivity surrounding the Townshend duty, sought to obscure the tax by arranging for its payment in London upon the tea's arrival in the colonies, or by having the consignees discreetly settle the duties post-sale of the tea. Of course, this endeavor was mainly done to conceal the tax from the colonists, but it didn't work. They were switched on. They knew what was going on. In September and October of 1773, 7 vessels transporting tea from the East India Company were dispatched to the colonies. 4 were destined for Boston, and 1 each for New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. The ships carried over 2,000 chests, containing approximately 600,000 pounds of tea. Americans became aware of the specifics of the Tea Act while the ships were in transit, and they were not impressed. The Whigs, occasionally referring to themselves as the Sons of Liberty, initiated a campaign to raise awareness and persuade or coerce the consignees to resign, mirroring the forced resignations of the stamp distributors during the 1765 Stamp Act crisis. Now, the protest movement culminating in the Boston Tea Party was not primarily a contention regarding elevated taxation. It didn't help, but it's not primarily because of that. The Tea Act of 1773 effectively lowered the price of legally imported tea, and protesters were primarily focused on a range of alternative issues. The well-known argument of no taxation without representation, coupled with the issues of the Parliament's jurisdiction over the colonies, persisted as a significant concern, of course. Samuel Adams regarded the British tea monopoly as pretty much equivalent to a tax. It's hard to argue against it. It's government intervention in business. That's not really fair either. Well, Samuel Adams had believed that it raised the same representation concerns, regardless of the imposition of a tax. Some people viewed the objective of the tax program to render senior officials autonomous from colonial influence as a perilous encroachment on colonial rights. This was particularly evident in Massachusetts itself, the sole colony where the Townshend program had been entirely executed. Colonial merchants, and that includes smugglers, significantly contributed to the protests. The Tea Act, by reducing the cost of legally imported tea, posed a threat to the tea smugglers' livelihood. Legitimate importers, not designated as consignees by the East India Company, faced threats of financial devastation due to these new laws. A significant concern for the merchants was that the Tea Act conferred a monopoly on the tea trade to the East India Company, raising apprehensions that this government-sanctioned monopoly could essentially expand to encompass additional commodities in the future. Once again, you give an inch, they take a mile. Protesters in New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston forced the tea co-signees to resign. By early December in Charleston, the co-signees were compelled to resign, and customs officials confiscated the unclaimed tea. Mass protest assemblies occurred in Philadelphia. Benjamin Rush implored his compatriots to resist the arrival of the new tea shipments, as the shipment harbored the seeds of slavery, which is pretty ironic because of the slavery actually going on, but, Well, by early December, the co-signees in Philadelphia had relinquished their claims, and in late December, the tea ship returned to England with its cargo after an altercation with the ship's captain. The tea ship destined for New York City was impeded by poor weather. Upon its arrival, the co-signees had forfeited their claims, resulting in the ship's return to England with the tea. In all colonies, except Massachusetts, demonstrators successfully compelled the tea co-signees to resign or repatriate the tea to England. In Boston itself, Governor Hutchinson was resolute in maintaining his position. He persuaded the tea co-signees, two of whom were his own sons, to remain resolute. Upon the arrival of the tea ship Dartmouth in Boston Harbor in late November, Whig leader Samuel Adams convened a mass meeting at Faneuil Hall on November 29, 1773. A multitude of individuals attended, necessitating the relocation of the meeting to a more spacious Old South Meeting House. British law mandated that Dartmouth unload and remit duties within 20 days, failing which customs officials could seize the cargo, i.e., transfer it onto American territory. This mass meeting adopted a resolution proposed by Adams and derived from the comparable set of resolutions issued previously in Philadelphia, urging the captain of the Dartmouth to return the ship without remitting the import duty. Simultaneously, the meeting designated 25 men to monitor the ship and obstruct the unloading of the tea, which included several chests from Davidson, Newman and Co. of London. Governor Hutchinson denied permission for the Dartmouth to depart without remitting the duty. Two additional tea vessels, Eleanor and Beaver, docked in the Boston harbor. On December 16th, the final day of Dartmouth's deadline, roughly 5,000 to 7,000 individuals from an estimated population of 16,000 congregated around the Old South Meeting House. Upon receiving a report that Governor Hutchinson had once more denied the departure of the ships, Adams declared, "This meeting can do nothing further to save the country." According to a prevalent narrative, Adams' remark served as a pre-arranged signal for the commencement of the Tea Party. This assertion was not published until almost a century post-event in a biography of Adams authored by his great-grandson, who seemingly misinterpreted the evidence. Eyewitness accounts indicate that individuals did not depart the meeting until 10 to 15 minutes following Adams' purported signal, and Adams actively attempted to prevent attendees from leaving as the meeting had not yet concluded. As Samuel Adams attempted to regain authority over the meeting, individuals exited the Old South Meeting House to mobilize for action. In certain instances, this entailed wearing intricately crafted mohawk costumes. Concealing their identities was essential due to the unlawful nature of their protest. and adopting the attire of Mohawk warriors was a deliberate and symbolic decision. The Sons of Liberty prioritized their identification with America over their official status as subjects of Great Britain. That very evening, a contingent of 30 to 130 men, some of them decked out in the Mohawk warrior garb, boarded the 3 vessels, and over a span of 3 hours disposed of all 342 chests of tea into the water. Now, the exact location of the Griffin's Wharf site of the tea party has long been disputed. A thorough investigation identifies it near the base of Hutchinson Street, which is now Pearl Street. Either way, the damage totaled a destruction of £92,000, that's of weight, or 340 chests of tea, as reported by the British East India Company, valued in 2024 terms of about $1.7 million. And here we have the first-hand account of the events from a Boston shoemaker by the name of George Hughes, who was there at the time and provides us with a pretty good perspective. The tea destroyed was contained in 3 ships, lying near each other at what was called at that time Griffin's Wharf. On the day before the 17th, there was a meeting of the citizens in the county of Suffolk, convened at one of the churches in Boston for the purpose of consulting on measures to prevent the landing of the tea or secure the people from the collection of the duty. When the committee returned and informed the meeting of the absence of the governor, there was a confused murmur among the members, and the meeting was immediately dissolved, many of them crying out, "Let every man do his duty and be true to his country." It was now evening, and I immediately dressed myself in the costume of an Indian, equipped with a small hatchet. After having painted my face and hands with coal dust in the shop of a blacksmith, I repaired to Griffin's Wharf, where the ships lay that contained the tea. When I first appeared in the street after being thus disguised, I fell in with many who were dressed, equipped and painted as I was, and who fell in with me and marched in order to the place of our destination. When we arrived at the wharf, there were 3 of our number who had already assumed authority to direct operations, to which we readily submitted. We were immediately ordered by the respective commanders to board all the ships at the same time, which we promptly obeyed. The commander of the division to which I belonged, as soon as we were on board the ship, appointed me boatswain, and ordered me to go to the captain and demand him the keys to the hatches and a dozen candles. I made the demand accordingly, and the captain promptly replied. We then were ordered by our commander to open the hatches and take out all the chests of tea and throw them overboard, and we immediately proceeded to execute the order, first cutting and splitting the chests with our tomahawks so as to thoroughly expose them to the effects of the water. In about 3 hours from the time we went on board, we had thus broken and thrown overboard every tea chest to be found in the ship, while those in the other ships were disposing of the tea in the same way at the same time. We were surrounded by British armed ships, but no attempt was made to resist us. During the time we were throwing the tea overboard, there were several attempts made by some of the citizens of Boston and its vicinity to carry off small quantities for their family to use. To effect that object, they would watch their opportunity to snatch up a handful from the deck, where it became plentifully scattered, and put it into their pockets. One Captain O'Connor, whom I well knew, came on board for that purpose, and when he supposed he was not noticed, filled his pockets and also the lining of his coat. but I detected him and gave information to the captain of what he was doing. We were ordered to take him into custody, and just as he was stepping from the vessel, I seized him by the skirt of his coat. He had to run a gauntlet through the crowd upon the wharf, 9 each one, as he passed, giving him a kick or a stroke. The next morning, after we had cleared the ships of the tea, it was discovered that very considerable quantities of it were floating upon the surface of the water, and to prevent the possibility of any of its being saved for use, a number of small boats were manned by sailors and citizens, who rowed them into those parts of the harbour wherever the tea was visible, and by beating it with oars and paddles, so thoroughly drenched it as to render its entire destruction inevitable. End of the account. Another tea vessel destined for Boston, the William, ran aground at Cape Cod in December of 1773, resulting in its tea being taxed and sold to private individuals. In March 1774, the Sons of Liberty obtained intelligence regarding tea stored in a Boston warehouse, subsequently infiltrated the facility and obliterated everything inside. A portion of it had already been sent to Davidson, Newman and Co., and was retained in their store. On March the 7th, the Sons of Liberty once again, more attired as Mohawks, infiltrated the shop and disposed of the remaining tea into the harbour. The involvement of Samuel Adams in planning the Boston Tea Party is a bit of a contentious issue. However, he promptly endeavored to promote and justify it. He contended that the Tea Party was not an unlawful mob, but rather a principled demonstration, and the sole recourse available for the populace for safeguarding their constitutional rights and freedoms. And so on December 17th of the year 1773, Samuel's second cousin and fellow founding father John Adams noted in his journal that the Boston Tea Party was a watershed event in the American Revolution. He wrote as follows: "This is the most magnificent movement of all. There is a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in this last effort of the patriots that I greatly admire. The people should never rise without doing something to be remembered, something notable and striking. The destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid and inflexible, that it must have been so important in its consequence, and so lasting, that I can't but consider it as an epoch in history." This act galvanized all political factions against the colonies, even among those politicians who were formerly thought to be sympathetic to colonial interests. Whatever the consequence, we must risk something. If we do not, all is over, Prime Minister Lord North had said. So in response, the British government shut down the port of Boston and enacted additional laws collectively referred to as the Intolerable Acts. They believed this action could not go unpunished. Benjamin Franklin asserted that the East India Company ought to be compensated for the spoilt tea in the amount of £90,000, about $1.8 million or so in today's money. The sum calculated at 2 shillings per pound. Along with 3 other merchants, Robert Murray travelled to New York to approach Lord North about covering the losses, but the offer was rejected. When word eventually got out about the Boston Tea Party in January, Parliament reacted by passing a series of laws that the colonies collectively called the aforementioned Intolerable Acts. This had a similar impact in North America. The stated goals was to re-establish British control in Massachusetts, punish Boston for its destruction of private property, and reform American colonial administration in general. colonists outside of Massachusetts were worried that their government could be changed by legislative fiat in England, and even though the first three acts, the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, and the Administration of Justice Act, only applied to Massachusetts, they were still worried about overreach. All it takes is a small edit to expand the scope. The intolerable acts brought together many colonists across the United States because they were seen as an infringement of their natural rights, colonial charters, and constitutional freedoms. And so, the Tea Party served as an example for many of the colonists who went on to commit similar protests. A number of events, including the Boston Tea Party, contributed to the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War. Britain abolished taxes on colonies that could adequately pay for imperial defense and officers' salaries in the Conciliatory Resolution, which was passed in 1775. As part of yet another unsuccessful attempt on conciliation by Parliament, the Taxation of Colonies Act of 1778 repealed the tax on tea. In the aftermath of the Boston Tea Party, many Americans, including John Adams, saw tea consumption as unpatriotic. Coffee replaced tea as the popular hot beverage during and after the Revolution, and so it has been ever since. I don't find too many Americans who are drinking tea. It's funny how that's kept going. Historical scholar Alfred Young states that the phrase Boston Tea Party was not actually used in print until 1834. We did mention at the start of the video the term destruction of the tea had been previously used to describe the occurrence. But according to Young, the American Revolution was largely neglected in historical accounts because American authors were hesitant to glorify the looting for a long time. However, things did start to change in the 1830s, particularly when biographies of George Robert Twelves Hughes, one of the surviving members of the Tea Party, were published. Many other political demonstrations have made reference to the Boston Tea Party. A British newspaper likened Mahatma Gandhi's 1908 mass burning of Indian registration cards in South Africa to the Boston Tea Party. And in 1930, following the Indian salt protest campaign, Gandhi met with the Viceroy of India. He smiled and took some duty-free salt from his shawl, saying, "It is to remind us of the famous Boston Tea Party." And so, protesters in the United States ever since have used this as an example of a rallying cry. And that's on both sides of the aisle. On the occasion of the Tea Party's bicentennial in 1973, a large gathering was in front of Faneuil Hall to demand the removal of President Richard Nixon from office and to voice opposition to oil companies amidst the continuing oil crisis. Later, in Boston Harbor, demonstrators climbed a mock ship, hung an effigy of Nixon from the mast, and emptied multiple oil drums into the water, which is obviously not good. Well, let's hope that they don't do that again. The last thing that the seas and the oceans need is more oil in them. I leave that to BP. That's their area of expertise. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the party. I'd like to thank my top-tier supporters, Dark, Gary, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Erin, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, Fizabo, Legitmus, Maverick, Susan, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Cameron, Alexander, Nicholas, Daniel, JR, Charlene, and Christopher. Thank you so much. And I will see you in the next exciting episode. Who knows where we'll be next? 2 American history videos in a row, though. That is interesting. Maybe more American history. I really want to do a full one on the Texas Revolution. And the Mexican-American War, too. I'll get there eventually. But for now, good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all.